All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining today. Hope everybody's having a better start to 2022 than I am. As you can tell, I have a bit of a black eye. That's what happens when you try and follow a 13 and 17-year-old down a black diamond ski run, and you meet an untimely end with the ice. And so I ended up with a black eye this weekend, and so hopefully you guys can overlook that as we go through the presentation today. So all kinds of funny jokes have been made, and we could recap them here, but I think I'll save you all of that fun. So Jacob, welcome. Glad to have
Thanks,
you on
Scott.
today.
Thanks, Scott.
All right, so we have a great session here today. Something I've been looking forward to for quite a while. Talking about the shared responsibility model. We're going to go through a number of things in this session. It's going to be a little bit longer than our normal sessions are because we also wanted to leave some time for questions at the end. And so, I'm going to hand it over here to Jacob. Jacob's going to kick it off, and we're going to go through the first portion that Jacob is going to primarily present, and I will be jumping in here and there. And then as we get toward the end, I'm going to present the last few slides in the deck as well. So, Jacob, I'm going to hand it over to you and let you kick us off.
Awesome. Thanks, Scott. Yeah, so I'm also very excited to talk about this topic because it's very important, and it is probably the one thing that makes CMMC seem easier than trying to chase teenagers down a ski slope is using this shared responsibility model as a tool for facilitating CMMC certification, compliance, control implementation. It's very versatile. But like you said, it is a very large topic that integrates a bunch of different ideas across standards and models and regulations, along with concepts and translating that into practice. So we have a lot of things that we need to cover, but at the end, we'll get nice and practical in terms of how people can actually leverage it to go after what they're searching for CMMC, in their everyday implementations. So there's a couple of sort of well-known aspects of security in the industrial base that people all know about, but maybe we haven't connected the dots on before. So one of those ideas is that the majority of the defense industrial base is made up of small and medium-sized businesses. There's been different sound bites. Typically, anytime a senior official from the department testifies before the Senate Armed Services Committee or somewhere in Congress, they will have some soundbite about how many small businesses make up the defense industrial base. And most recently, Jesse Salazar pointed out that it's specifically in the sub-tiers of the defense industrial base, the people who are most impacted by CMMC requirements and DFARS cybersecurity regulations, 74% of those people are small and medium-sized businesses. So it is very relevant. Anytime we talk about anything that helps or facilitates or makes CMMC and compliance harder, it is impacting small businesses by and large. The other part about security in the defense industrial base is the fact that it's not going well. Implementation across the industrial base for cybersecurity requirements has been bad for a long time. It continues to be bad, and we've seen this documented both by the department, for instance, in this DoD IG report. We've seen it in industry reports. We've seen it, consistently over the years, and it was specifically because of findings like this that actually led to the CMMC program as we know it today, because people have requirements, they're not being implemented properly, and so we need to come up with a catalyst for driving that implementation. Most recently, and what's quite interesting, is that GAO, during the sort of programmatic review throughout 2021 of the CMMC program, as an independent agency reviewing the program, interviewed DIBCAC, which is the auditing team that works for DoD, the actual DoD employees that go out and assess and audit control implementation. Of the companies, the 110 companies that they have worked with between 2019 and 2020, only 16% had satisfactorily demonstrated that they were meeting all of their requirements, a phenomenally low number, given the fact that DIBCAC typically works with companies that are slightly larger than the average small business, usually better resourced. They're still not doing well either. So these are aspects of security in the DIB that people are typically familiar with. But one aspect that people sometimes overlook is how heavily reliant small businesses are in general on outsourced services. These could be cloud services. These could be managed IT services. Typically, they could be managed security services. And the managed services industry is growing by leaps and bounds, specifically because of findings like the ones in this report. Overall, in North America, Europe, APAC region, 80% of small businesses rely on these outsourced services. And typically it is a significant portion of their annual spend on those outsourced services. In our experience, what we've seen is that probably for the small businesses in the industrial base, their average spend is much higher than 20% on outsourced services just because of the lack of internal resources. So when we start to connect the dots, the problem here is that people are, they're running small, medium-sized businesses, they're doing DoD work, but they are relying on these outsourced parties to facilitate their control implementation and to facilitate their assessment readiness. But what we know from the findings is that it's not working. And one of the reasons that we think that it's not working is the fact that if you are a company that needs to implement Nist SP 800-171 controls in order to comply with regulations, and you use any sort or any amount of outsourced services, this could be, like I said, cloud, managed IT, or security, then you are already using a concept known as the shared responsibility model, which we'll explain in detail, but effectively is just this idea that you are sharing the burden of complying with these regulations and implementing these requirements. And that's, very interesting because most people who are in this situation don't necessarily know that they have this problem. They don't necessarily know that they are leveraging a shared responsibility model. They don't necessarily have any context for that shared responsibility model in terms of what it looks like inside their business. They especially don't have any context for what it looks like within implementing the specific controls regarding Nist SP 800-171 and CMMC, those actual tangible details of what it looks like. And that overall leads to a distinct lack of assessment readiness, as we've seen through these reports. Now, when it comes down to things like CMMC, where the stakes of not making it through an assessment are getting higher and higher, that becomes a more and more important problem to pay attention to, because it's no longer a situation where we write a report, no one's implemented the controls. As we've seen from the government, if you start to have that same level of performance, then you won't get work from the government anymore. So it's definitely a problem that we need to fix. The way that you fix it, though, is by using this sort of idea called a shared responsibility matrix, actually translating and operationalizing it from a concept into your business.
So Jacob, one of the things that, you really have when you're dealing with this kind of situation with, small businesses or even mid-sized or large businesses that outsource their support, outsourced a portion of their support or of their assessment readiness, if you will, to a third party, is expectation management, right? And so if you have this set of expectations that you have as a consumer of these services, are you sure that expectation that you have is shared with that third-party provider? And if you are not sure of that and you don't have that written down somewhere, then how do you know who's going to be doing what, right? I mean, that's the whole case for the shared responsibility model and documenting this, because the worst thing that can happen is for you to get into an assessment and have a set of expectations that then don't get met because your provider is not expecting to provide that capability to you as a customer, right? And so that just kind of makes the case for making sure that you have this well defined before you get into an assessment and even into with just basic implementation.
Yeah, it's like we were saying earlier, the absolute wrong time to be surprised about the nature of the sharing that's going on with you and your managed provider, whatever service it happens to be, is during an assessment. That is the wrong time to find out that what you were expecting isn't actually what you're getting. So it actually is kind of ironic when you think about this sort of lack of understanding, lack of context within the specific business, lack of context within the specific requirements, leading to an overall lack of readiness. Because the irony here is that we're going through more and more intense levels of assessment because self-attestation just doesn't really work. We've demonstrated this over the years. But if you don't have this translation, this shared responsibility matrix that establishes and documents the relationship and the expectations and the responsibilities across your control environment and between these parties, internal and external, then you're effectively just doing self-attestation with more steps. You are in the position that the government is in, where you just have to take their word for it that things are occurring, and you don't find out until assessment day that maybe it was working, maybe it wasn't working. And we really want to avoid that situation by all means. And the shared responsibility matrix is a very convenient way of avoiding that surprise and facilitating this assessment readiness. That's and, right. Just as we get into talking about some of the details, as you pointed out, if you don't have this, this level of documentation, this level of detail of what's going on, you don't have any visibility into your control environment. You don't have any clarity into what you're paying for or who is going to be responsible for answering questions during an assessment. You just don't know what's going on. And that leads to a distinct lack of assurance, either for your investment or for your likelihood of passing an assessment. The convenient part, though, is that if you have this shared responsibility matrix, if you're able to work with a company and partner with a company that has gone through the tedium of creating a sufficiently detailed shared responsibility matrix, there are some distinct and large advantages. In my professional opinion, if you have a properly established, robust, detailed shared responsibility matrix, it is the number one indicator of the likelihood of a company passing CMMC. I say that both as a provisional assessor, I say that as a provisional instructor who teaches the certified assessors in classes occasionally, based off of everything that I have experienced in the field across all sort of facets of the ecosystem. Most companies need to have this shared responsibility matrix properly documented at the right level of detail. If you can do that, then you are well on your way to making this assessment a formality rather than a surprise.
And Jacob, and more so than just the assessment. I mean, the assessment is something that happens, from a CMMC standpoint, once every 3 years.
Right.
But there's a much more, or as important, is your day-to-day operations, right?
Absolutely.
And if you don't have this model built out, you have expectations on day-to-day operations. You want to make sure that those day-to-day operations every single day are being taken care of in a certain way. So yes, the assessment is important, but your day-to-day operational stature, execution is critically important just for the running of your business, right?
Absolutely, and that's even the third point here is that a lot of people see the level of detail that we're going to get into in terms of what needs to be captured, and they sort of shy away because it seems like a lot of work. But the other side of going through that level of detail is establishing the assurance. Literally, the detailed questions that the assessors will ask you are designed to find out, are the controls implemented correctly? Are they operating as intended? Are they producing the desired outcomes? I mean, all of the things that you would want to know in terms of your day-to-day operations that the government wants to know every few years are accomplished through the same piece of work. So it is a very convenient way of killing two birds with one stone here. Now, the changes under CMMC 2.0, the reconfiguration, the calibration, some of the alignment of CMMC to Nist 800-171, which we'll talk about in detail, have yielded some more surprises for folks if they weren't aware of needing this shared responsibility matrix, because it is required by CMMC both by assumption in terms of the way that Nist 800-171 and CMMC was originally designed, and it is also required by reference in some of the new documentation, which we'll talk about in detail as we go through. But ultimately, the idea here is that you need to take this shared responsibility model that you are already operating under, most likely, translate it into something that's tangible in order to derive these benefits and then reach your goals for assurance on a day-to-day basis and assurance on an assessment basis, however often that comes through. Now, like you said, there's a lot that we have to cover in terms of how you get to that conclusion and demonstrate what it actually looks like. The first is, like we said, a lot of people don't even know what the shared responsibility model really is, even though they're using it pretty often. So we have to cover the basics of the shared responsibility model and establish why you need a matrix to translate it. Then we're going to talk about why most control mappings that companies end up with from their service providers, usually they end up with some sort of open-ended control mapping, high-level control mapping. Those are insufficient for what you need for your own assurances and for assurances under the assessment, which will be a deep dive into 800-171. After we get done going down into the weeds, we need to tie everything together for CMMC and DFARS, because it's a very, very common, probably the most common question that I get all the time is, how does DFARS, CMMC, and 171 all interlock and interface together? It's very easy to lose track of how those work together, but we'll clear all that up to go all the way down from the weeds all the way back up to the big picture. And that sets up basically the entirety of the problem and what people need to do. And we have, gone through our approach of how we've developed and translated the model into the shared responsibility matrix within the context of our projects and our services, so we can give some clear examples about what we need to do next for actually, picking up and running with this idea towards success with these requirements. Okay, so like we said, first place we need to start is, what is the idea of the shared responsibility model? And the shared responsibility model is this fundamental concept from cloud security. It is sort of the basic cornerstone of all cloud security. And the essential idea is that the level of service that you are consuming from an external provider influences the amount of control that either you or the provider have over those services. Your level of responsibility changes based off of how much service you are acquiring from an external provider. The classic example from cloud computing is if you're running an entirely on-premises IT system, your IT network, all of your infrastructure on-prem, you do everything. You're responsible for everything from the physical security and the metal all the way up into the configuration of software and applications. Whereas on the other side of the spectrum, if you are just consuming a software application as a service, everything except for what is inside of that application is the responsibility of the provider, whoever you are establishing this service level with. And this can change. This level of responsibility and control will shift depending on this level of service as it changes. And that's the entire basis of the idea of a shared responsibility model. Now, this translates from cloud computing into other external services like managed IT or managed security, because if you are heavily or sometimes entirely reliant on your external provider to implement controls, configure controls, whatever your agreement and service level happens to be, most people who are small businesses in the industrial base assume that they are consuming much more responsibility from the provider than they are actually responsible for. And as we will find out, that starts to get into issues because both the external providers on average and the small and medium businesses on average are unaware of the level of detail that you need to start splitting up the responsibility and the service levels at. Okay, so like we said, the shared responsibility model is something that applies to all external services, and it is not uncommon for this to be a foreign concept for people. It is actually the number one thing that people misinterpret or don't understand about consuming cloud services, is that there is still this shared matrix. We've seen this with the rise of everything as a service. Typically the catchphrase for the shared responsibility model in the cloud is that the provider is responsible for the security of the cloud, whereas the consumer or the customer is responsible for everything that's in the cloud. Now, the more you outsource, the more they're responsible for, but typically it is almost impossible for you to completely outsource all responsibility for configuration or controls or operations. And we'll get into the details of what that looks like in 800-171 in just a second. But this is an easy enough concept, right? That you're gonna be acquiring and consuming these services, and you pay for a tailored service that provides more responsibility and it takes it out of your hair. You don't have to worry about as much of it. But for that concept to be translated into what you're actually doing, the big topic is, what does this look like in terms of CMMC and 800.171 controls? There needs to be some sort of an interface between the model and the practice. And we achieve that translation through something called a shared responsibility matrix. So the big takeaway from the idea of what is the basic idea of the shared responsibility model is that you can't really run effective governance or effective risk management or compliance without this translation layer, this shared responsibility matrix. It is the natural output of identifying and dividing responsibilities between customers and providers. It is going to specifically identify the person or the team that is responsible for a given security control or part of a security control. And most importantly, it needs to be agreed upon and ideally reflected in your contracts or your service level agreements, whatever your contractual mechanism is between you and your service provider. A lot of people are under the expectation that they are on an agreement that gives, they basically have no responsibility. Like I said before, a lot of people are operating under the expectation that it is entirely their managed or external service providers' responsibility to get them compliant. And then when it comes down to assessment time and people start asking questions and the SLAs and the terms of the contract don't match up with your expectations, then that's when the surprise starts to set in. So it is more than just going from theory to practice. It also needs to be captured in something that's enforceable.
And, to build on that a little bit, it's not possible for an organization to completely outsource all responsibility for an assessment or operating their environment or defining the parameters of that environment being operated in, right? As we'll see when we get to some of the later slides, there are some things within 800.171 that literally a third-party provider simply cannot do. And so we'll talk about a little bit about that and how we approach, how do you approach that, and how much can you outsource? How much is it possible to outsource, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, I'm really glad you brought that up, because not only is the big takeaway from this section of the basics of the shared responsibility model the fact that you need a matrix to contextualize it for your situation, but like you said, within the context of 800.171, these specific control requirements, it needs to be sufficiently detailed. And there are some ideas behind 171 that some people are not always familiar with. So a nice natural segue into, okay, we need a matrix for applying the model to our business, but what does that look like within the constraints of 171? These control requirements that we're obligated to implement. So there are essentially three things to 800.171 that most people miss. And control matrices and mappings, typically what people get when they work with external providers in the ecosystem around 171 and CMMC, there's typically three things that they miss. The first and the most important is that 800.171, Nist SP 800.171, is only half of the model. There is another half to it that contains all the details that are actually the parts you need to pay attention to whenever you're working with a matrix. We're going to explain what that means. The other part that carries over from how much more detail is below the surface, if you will, actually under the hood of the document that most people have read, is what the meaning of the term fully implemented is. This is a common issue that pops up when people need to do their self-assessments and upload their scores into SPRS after the interim rule came out at the end of 2020. Most people don't know that there is more detail, and they don't know that there is a specific meaning behind the phrase fully implemented. The third idea that is, carries over even further is that the hybrid nature of the details of how you implement a control will complicate this idea known as inheritance. A lot of people, when they use an external provider, are operating under the assumption that they get to what's called inherit their controls. By the fact that your external provider is taking care of, they are responsible for controls, you are inheriting that controls implementation, so you're good during an assessment. That is not true most of the time because of the details that are contained in the other part of 800.171, which we'll dive into here. So this is going to be a very short summary of a longer talk that we gave recently at a CS2 event in San Diego. So I believe that we'll be able to link it in chat, as well as other places for resources. If people are interested in more details behind why the things I'm about to say are true, is an hour-long talk explaining in all the detail why this situation is the way it is. But the ultimate takeaway is, like I said, NIST 800.171 is only half of the model. If you go to the NIST 800.171 webpage, over on the right-hand side, it says that the other part of this publication is NIST SP 800.171A. NIST SP 800.171A is the assessment procedures for the security requirements that are documented in 800.171. Now, why they are two separate documents is a much longer conversation, and I would tell people to definitely go watch the video, but the key thing to remember is there are two parts of this model, and the most important one is not the one that most people have read. So most people are typically familiar with the idea that NIST 800.171 controls look like this, right? This is typically no fun for anyone because it doesn't really help a whole lot. The basic elements of a NIST 800.171 control are the control ID, what we refer to the control as, something called the control statement, which is the actual control that people read. This is usually the one that people complain about being too nebulous or too hard to understand, doesn't actually tell you anything. And then a discussion statement, which is NIST's best attempt at trying to explain a very open-ended idea in the control statement. And, as we know, this is very frustrating to try to figure out what are they actually talking about? What are they actually looking for? Now, the answer is that what they are looking for is in 800.171A. So 800.171A is a much more complicated standard, but it is the other side of the individual controls. So 800.171 has 3 elements to every control. The assessment procedures have 7. And so we're just going to step through very quickly what those elements are. At the top, we still have the same thing. We have the control ID, the identifier for whatever the control is that we're talking about. That'll be an important thing to remember when we talk about CMMC. You have the control statement, and then in the middle you have something known as an assessment objective. Every control statement has a corresponding assessment objective. An assessment objective consists of some number of what are known as determination statements. Determination statements are the sort of breakdown of what is listed in the control statement. Think of it as, the example I use is a sentence diagram. It is the dissected form of what it says at the top, the thing that most people have read in 800.171. Below that is something known as assessment methods. There are 3. You can examine documents, you can interview people, you can test mechanisms like hardware and software, security devices and appliances and things like that. And there is a list of what are known as assessment objects, the actual examples of those things that you might apply an assessment method to. This whole thing taken together is known as an assessment procedure. We have to apply assessment methods to assessment objects in order to make a determination some number of times to figure out if the assessment objective has been met for a particular requirement. So if you want to know what that control statement in 171 is saying, you need to go look at the corresponding assessment procedures. So a lot of information going on here, but the good news is that this is sort of the totality of what those controls are talking about, because when the certified CMMC assessors go through their training for what they're going to ask on assessment day, this is what they're taught to. This is how NIST properly decomposes requirements into the steps and things that you need to do to know if something is properly implemented, if it is working correctly, if we have all the elements that we need to have assurance that the requirement is in place. Now, the last...
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, I'll let you finish.
I was just going to say the last most important element here is that sometimes in those determination statements, there are things known as organizationally defined values. These are parameters. They are variables that need to be established typically before the rest of the steps can happen. So in this example here on the screen, you have to identify who your authorized users are. You have to identify what your authorized processes are. And you need to identify devices that are going to be authorized to operate. Now, once you have established your authorized users, processes, and devices, then you can limit access, you can control access to those things. So the assessment objectives are broken down into these statements, and those statements are typically sequential, where you have to define a parameter and then do a thing. And so if you're reading ahead here, you can start to see a pattern emerge where once we break into more detail, there's going to be a sequence of events that needs to happen. Typically, what's going to happen is the organizationally defined parameters are going to be things that the customer is responsible for, whereas the actual actions that are taking place as a result, based off of what you are specifying, is what your external providers are going to be responsible for. And we'll explain what that looks like.
Yeah, and Nist didn't help us too much on some of these. That they didn't really normalize, for example, the interviewers, right? Who's going to be interviewed? They didn't really normalize that across the 320 assessment objectives, right?
That's right. Yeah, that's right. There are 110 controls in NIST 800-171. There are 320 of these determination statements. Typically what happens is people use the phrase determination statement and assessment objective interchangeably. They effectively are referring to the same thing. So, if we sort of move on from the detail, which we'll refer back to here in a moment, but if you sort of move on to what that means for 171A, like we said, every control has an assessment objective. Every assessment objective has some number of determination statements, and determination statements each need evidence in order to be satisfied. There are 320 determination statements in 800-171A, and the idea of fully implemented controls is that every determination statement has at least one piece of evidence. Now, typically, you're going to require much more than one piece of evidence, but at least one piece of evidence through an assessment procedure, through doing something, has to be established for every determination statement. And you can verify this by emailing DoD CIO, and they will give you the official answer, just like they gave to us, to verify that this is true. We will also see this reflected later on when we tie this back directly into CMMC with the updated guidance. That is typically news for both small businesses in the industrial base as well as their service providers, because like we said, most people are operating off of a control mapping or a control matrix at the control statement level, the 110 control level, not the 320 assessment objective level. And as we've seen, there starts to be some divisions very quickly between who's responsible for which determination statements, and that's really going to start to define the boundaries of what your shared responsibility matrix looks like.
Yeah, and as we went through this, there's very, very few controls where all of the assessment objectives and determination statements are on the backs of a individual, either the outsourced provider or the customer, right?
Absolutely.
Very, very few. Yeah,
and that's exactly right. And so when we think about, carry over from some details about how NIST controls really work, and this is, we're towards the bottom of the rabbit hole here. We only have a little bit further to go. In the world of NIST controls, there is really only 3 ways to implement a control for you to meet all of those determination statements. There is what is known as a system-specific control, which is something, think of that as the equivalent of an on-prem system. You are doing everything by yourself. All those determination statements, you are doing all of them. There's something known as a common control, which is consider that to be all of the assessment objectives belong to someone else, and you are, completely inheriting that control implementation. Most people are operating off of the idea that their external services, their MSPs, their MSSPs, are giving them common controls. And that's not actually true, because the third and most common situation that occurs with NIST 800-171 and CMMC is that people are implementing things in a hybrid manner. Literally what NIST calls hybrid or shared controls, that certain parts of the control are implemented by different people, different stakeholders, probably internal, external, or across different departments, depends on the size of the organization. But when you look to the description of a hybrid or a shared control, and it says different parts of the control belong to, or they are the responsibility of different people, if you've only ever looked at 800-171 with single control statements, you're probably saying, what other parts? There's only one line here that describes the control. The other parts are the determination statements that are contained in those assessment objectives.
So one thing you said there, and I want to pull the thread a little bit because I want to make sure that people understand how important this is, not just for companies. Obviously the vast majority of companies are using some kind of external third-party provider for something, right? But there are companies that do everything in-house, right? Mm-hmm. Do they need a shared responsibility matrix within in-house? I would say yes, right? Because you've got your security team, you've got your IT team, you've got your executive team. Somebody's making decisions, somebody's implementing, somebody's monitoring. You need to know inside your organization who is doing what to ensure that you have everything covered, right?
Absolutely. And this really, this gets back to the idea of just, even if you're doing everything internally and you don't use any external services in any way, basic project management of who is doing what by when and how is going to be essentially, if you think about it in your head, is a matrix of responsibility, a shared responsibility matrix, if you will. The only difference being most small businesses, for very good reason, leverage these external providers because they just don't have the resources internally. There's all sorts of good reasons. The trap, though, is that because very few people at external providers and within, DoD contractors, because they are not familiar with the other half of 800.171A, and because 800.171, as we'll see in a moment, gets pulled through to the inner workings of CMMC, you get left behind, and you end up in this situation where you will be surprised if you have not oriented, no matter how you're implementing your controls, if you have not oriented them at a sufficient level of detail. So we went quite far into the weeds of NIST 800.171, 171A, control implementations, lots of probably new vocabulary for people. Like I said, it's always very important to establish the relationship between 171 controls, 171A, DFARS, and CMMC, because they all work together. So the fundamental idea here on this very busy chart that we're going to walk through is that everything revolves around 800.171, right? So on the right-hand side, people are probably familiar with the DFARS 7012 clause that said you have to implement a whole number of things, one of which being the minimum requirements in 800.171A. Remember, the term fully implemented means that every determination statement has to have a piece of evidence for it. So to have 800.171 fully implemented, you have to have all 320 assessment objectives satisfied. There has to be viable evidence for all of them. So DFARS 7012, among other things, points to having to implement 800.171. The interim rule that came out at the end of 2020, in November 2020, established three other clauses: DFARS 7019, DFARS 7020, and DFARS 7021, which is the boogeyman, right? That's the one that says you have to get a CMMC certification. The fundamental idea underneath all three of those clauses and the interim rule is that they are different forms of assessment of the controls in 800.171. By extension, they are different forms of assessment of 800.171A. So if you are familiar, if you're familiar with 800.171 and 800.171A, everything in terms of DFARS cybersecurity clauses from the distant past with 7012 to the recent past with 7019, 20, and 21 revolves around that set of controls. CMMC itself is just a program that wraps around these controls to verify that they were implemented properly. I mean, like we talked about at the beginning, the entire reason why CMMC was established was to verify implementation, because every time we'd go out and do a report, we'd find that the controls weren't being implemented properly. Now, very important caveat here with DFARS 7012, and this is one of your favorite topics, Scott, is paragraph B, where it talks about adequate security, doesn't just point to 800.171. The other element that it points to is that if you are going to put CUI, controlled and classified information, into the cloud, it has to be a FedRAMP moderate certified service or equivalent to FedRAMP moderate, which I know, is something that you are always eager to bring up because it's something that people forget about in this maze of clauses here.
Well, it's really critical for a number of reasons. One, you have to make sure that any cloud service that you're directly using is going to be FedRAMPed, right? I mean, you want to make sure that you're using FedRAMP services. And maybe you can talk a little bit more about the FedRAMP moderate equivalency here in a second as well, and what that means. But you not only have to look at the services that you're directly using, but you have to look at the services that your service providers are using if they're going to potentially have controlled and classified information in their environment, right? So if you are leveraging a third-party provider, an MSP or an MSSP, and that third-party provider is leveraging the cloud service, and there's a potential that your CUI could flow through to that third-party provider's cloud service environment, then you have to ensure that they are also using FedRAMP services, right?
Right. Yeah, and you can find this too if anybody ends up doing reading about the concept of the shared responsibility model. You end up with these sort of concentric models that build on each other because things are connected and internetworked, as we all know, and the determining factor is data flow and responsibility assignment, not necessarily your network boundary. So the more and more you leverage external services, and the more and more those external services leverage their own external services, the more this map of responsibilities sort of has to be drawn out. It isn't, we always say it's not as simple as having, building a castle and everything inside belongs to you. Very, very rarely are companies entirely on-prem anymore. And that determination around FedRAMP certification is critical. Now, as a little bit of a caveat here, the phrase FedRAMP moderate equivalent is something that has been the source of hot debate recently. Back when they were writing this 7012 clause, they said, well, lots of companies in the industrial base are going to leverage cloud services. They're going to put CUI in the cloud for good reason, whatever it happens to be. But a lot of these companies are small businesses, like we talked about beforehand. And as a result, either the service that they are using is probably not FedRAMP, or they are not a large enough company to be able to acquire the licenses that they need to work within a FedRAMP certified service. So the DoD made a concession and they said, okay, if you're going to put CUI in the cloud, you can do what's called FedRAMP moderate equivalent. Now, if you look at the FedRAMP moderate baseline of controls, it's a list of security controls from Nist, just like 800.171 is. But what would be missing? If we only have a list of control statements, then that means that there is a corresponding set of assessment procedures for those controls. It is not a list of, I think it's 320 something controls in the moderate baseline. There are going to be a number of assessment objectives for every control that have their own determination statements, and the number of things that you would need to satisfy in order to know if the controls are implemented properly is much, much larger. It's probably close to 1,000 items that you would have to establish evidence for to know that they're implemented. Now, this gets to the idea of why you would want a certification. What does CMMC certification tell you? It tells you that somebody else came in and walked through those procedures and is verifying that they are implemented correctly, and they give you this certificate to prove that that has happened. Same thing with FedRAMP. They've walked through the assessment procedures. There are many, many more than what we have to do in 800.171. And they provide you this certificate to show that somebody else, other than the person that you're doing business with is just promising, has verified that this has actually taken place. Now, FedRAMP is very expensive, right? There are, it's an entire process. It's very lengthy. There's a lot of controls. It is an expensive process. So the DoD said it has to be equivalent. So equivalent to getting the certification would be walking through all the procedures to make sure that it is done correctly. So most companies put CUI in the cloud and they're not putting it in FedRAMP certified services or applications or environments. And they are also not going through the rigor of making sure that it is equivalent by going through these procedures, because most people don't even know that the assessment procedures are the other side of the controls.
And I can tell you from lots of experience working with cloud-based providers, as we developed our managed services offerings, we looked at all of the traditional tool sets that MSPs use for things from backup to monitoring to whatever, right? And, you go talk to the vast majority of these third-party provider, cloud providers that provide, services to managed service providers and MSSPs. You ask them about FedRAMP for their cloud service, and they're like, what's FedRAMP, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
They have no idea. I mean, this is not something that's even on their radar.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really actually a very good way of illustrating the problem in a larger situation that companies are facing regarding CMMC and 171. Because you would say, okay, yeah, there's no CMMC certification that you can go get right now. I need to have some level of assurance that these controls are implemented properly, even just on a day-to-day basis. How would you do that? You would do that by walking through the assessment procedures. And just like most people maybe don't even know what FedRAMP is, they don't know what 800-171A is. So, as we zoom out, and this is, it's very interesting because all of that conversation we just had takes place within paragraph B right here of DFARS 7012. There are other obligations, and this is the subject of probably another webinar. There are other obligations that defense contractors and their suppliers have according to DFARS 7012 besides just FedRAMP and 800-171, and they're covered in those other paragraphs, which I think people can probably chime in the chat if they would be interested in learning more about those in a different webinar. But the takeaway here is everything in DFARS cybersecurity land revolves around 800-171, and under the hood of 800-171 is the important part, 800-171A objectives and determination statements. So if we think about what CMMC actually is, CMMC is a program. The requirements are contained in 800-171. Now, this was very confusing for a lot of people for a very long time and continues to be, because what did they change under CMMC 1.0? They changed the control ID. Remember when we did the breakdown of the controls in 171, you have something that's like 3.1.1 or 3.1.2, and that's how they identified the control statement. Well, in CMMC, they have the exact same controls, just wrapped in a new program, a new name, and they change the control IDs. They are identical. Now, if you didn't know that 800-171A existed, you probably didn't know that the CMMC assessment guide, or CMMC-A, if you will, also existed. You just went from 110 to the CMMC 1.0 documentation at the statement level. But if you look into the past of 1.0 into their assessment guide, it literally takes the exact same language from 800-171A and copies it into CMMC. That is true because CMMC is the assessment program. It is the verification mechanism of the same controls. This is what led to the very annoying response from the government when people heard they were going to be assessed for the first time. And the government said, you should have already been doing this. And everybody said, that doesn't make any sense. This is all new. The government said, no. Remember 7012 over on the right-hand side of that previous slide? You had to do that since 2016, which means you had to do 171, which means you had to do 171A. This is just a new coat of paint on those same controls, and this is how we are going to do the verification. So that's what really led to that confusion. Now, if we jump forward to CMMC 2.0, everybody says, oh, well, CMMC 2.0 is a big change. CMMC 2.0 is exactly the same thing. It is a verification program for the same controls. Literally, we can flip between the slides here. It doesn't even change. When I made this slide, I didn't even have to move the red squares around in order to show that it is talking about NIST 800-171A. The controls are the same, the control objectives are the same, the determination statements are the same, the overall assessment procedure is the same. In fact, just to really pound the nail in terms of how integral 171 is to CMMC, the new control IDs for CMMC 2.0 are these gigantic long control IDs, but it actually has the previous 800-171 control ID in it. Here now it says AC.L1-3.1.1, which is the original control ID from 800-171. We've gone full circle. Started with the 171 IDs, changed them for some reason under 1.0. Now we have 2.0, and we merged them together to make sure that it was very apparent to everybody these are the same controls. So we've sort of seen the landscape of what it looks like for all the DFARS clauses oriented around 800-171 and 800-171A. CMMC itself is just one of those clauses. It is one form of assessment. It is a certification program that attempts to verify the control implementation of 800.171 controls. Now, this is all good and great, but it was all sort of maybe hard to keep track of, or you would have to know a lot about how Nist operates and how controls are engineered in an environment with a lot of cybersecurity resources at your disposal to know that that was the proper way to go through implementing and assessing these controls. But under CMMC 2.0, they actually clarified a lot of these ideas for us. And they say that you can do effectively one of three things when it comes to a control. You can either have it be met, or not applicable. Not applicable is a whole process in and of itself. But since 800.171 is a minimum baseline, most people are not able to achieve not applicable because it has been cut down to a minimum level of things that you need to do before it ever even showed up in your contracts. Now, what CMMC 2.0 does clarify is that in order for a control to be met, the control has to conform to all the objectives. It has to have all of the determination statements satisfied for a control objective to be properly implemented. And they go into more detail when they talk about this idea. And they say that the evidence from an enterprise, even if you're inheriting the control from an external provider, has to show that for the assets that are in scope for the assessment, that all of the assessment objectives are met. You can do it all on-prem. You can have it be implemented by an external provider, but you have to meet all of those assessment objective determination statements in order for something to be fully implemented. Remember, under CMMC, you got to have these controls implemented on assessment day. Now, you might be able to POAM some of the controls, you might be able to push some of them off, but you won't be able to push them off forever based off of what we know is currently going on. And there's even a minimum set that we've heard that you'll have to have implemented on assessment day. And if you're only operating off of the 110 list, you don't have a full picture. You don't have an assurance of what's going to occur when the assessor either tries to come in and judge what's going on, or when you're trying to evaluate on day-to-day operations, whether these controls are fully implemented. Here, it's just phrased in terms of CMMC 2.0, but it's exactly the same concept that applies to Nist controls in general. Now, they actually go a step further in CMMC 2.0. I mentioned at the very beginning that these control matrices are required both by assumption and by reference. Now, it is a longer talk. It is an entire webinar that would explain the underlying assumptions that were used to design the 110 control selections that now exist in 800.171a. The short story is there are a lot of controls that could have existed inside the minimum baseline, but in order to make the minimum baseline as small as possible and therefore as not burdensome as possible on the industrial base, the government assumed a whole lot of stuff about what the average business has in place, how much budget they have, how much resource they have, how much knowledge and understanding they have, what level of engineering rigor they have for cybersecurity, and they just threw all kinds of assumptions in to create this minimum baseline. So the biggest assumption in my mind is that if you are using an external provider to implement these controls, they assume that you have extended these requirements, exactly what you talked about earlier, Scott, that if you are going to leverage external providers, you can do that if you want to, but there are rules of the road for how you establish shared responsibility. Under 800.171 and DFARS, they assumed you did that. Here under 2.0, they've actually explicitly said, if you're using external service providers in common ways that people tend to use them, you need to look, the assessors need to look at the shared responsibility matrix that captures the nature of that relationship.
So you're telling me that not only do I have to worry about the shared responsibility of my environment specifically and build out a responsibility matrix for my environment, but then I have to layer that on top of what the service provider is doing. They may need a CMMC certification in addition to me getting my environment assessed. My provider may need to be assessed. And then we have to ensure that underneath all of that, if you're using cloud services, that it's all FedRAMPed. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that is exactly what I'm saying. Now, I wish the government were maybe more concise than they are in these lines that are buried here in the model, but that is the idea, that you can go nuts if you want to and use as many external services and cloud services and be as cutting edge and high tech as you want to. But the fundamental idea is that there are governance requirements that come when you use federally regulated data in environments like that, and you got to be able to keep track of what's going on and assure both yourself and the government that things are implemented properly, that they are working correctly, that they're producing desired outcomes. And so, depending on what you're doing, there are going to be assessment procedures to verify what's going on. Now, the nice part is that unlike other standards like ISO or PCI DSS or SOC 2 audits, the assessment guide is written down for us, right? It's a lot of details, but it's written down. It's not in an assessor's head. We know what the questions are. We know what the methods are. We know what the objects are. And so as a result, if you have a external provider that is aware of this, that is aware of the level of detail, aware of the types of obligations that exist, aware of what an assessment is going to look like and what it takes to be successful, you can engineer a shared responsibility matrix line for line with what is required in 171, what's required in DFARS, what's required in CMMC, and greatly alleviate this burden on, small and medium businesses. And, as it so happens, that's exactly what we've done. Okay, so like we were saying, you can go from knowledge of these, excruciating details that you need to walk through, all of these determination statements that are contained underneath the hood of the requirements, and you can reliably and predictably match those up with services that are offered based off of whatever type of business or service you happen to be offering. And you can demonstrably prove to clients, or you can ask from your service providers exactly what it is that they are offering you when they say, we will help facilitate your compliance with DFARS. We will help with your implementation of 800-171. We'll help do gap assessments. Everything revolves around the detail in those determination statements. So when you walk through and you look at those details and you start to do some analysis, like you said, it's actually a little bit sloppier than people would imagine. There's some duplicates in there. There's some weird phrasings in there. You got to go through and really clean up some of the data. But ultimately, the big takeaway is that 60% of the people who will be interviewed, remember there's three methods: examining, interviewing, and testing. And interviewing is going to be the big one. That's the one that you got to start with. That's going to be the one that everybody's going to be on the hook for. 60% of the responsibilities listed in 800-171A that are going to be asked questions about your control implementation during an assessment are made up by three roles that are typically outsourced in a standard external managed service provider relationship. They are personnel responsible for information security, system and network administrators, and the developers and the designers of your architecture and of your information system. I mean, more than half the time, the people that you are outsourcing are going to be the ones that are on the hook for answering detailed questions about the totality of that control, all of the determination statements for that control. And this gets back to that idea earlier, where if you don't have that level of detail agreed upon and documented in your SLA or in your contract, then these three people here are not going to be able to answer questions, and you're going to end up getting surprised.
And there's others as well. I mean, this is just the top three. There are others that may be, outsourced as well, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So there are, as you go through, there are, unique roles typically for a specific control. So if you're talking about vulnerability scan, then it's going to be somebody who's responsible directly for vulnerability scanning. Broadly, that's going to be somebody who's responsible for information security. But the nature of the controls, like you said before, almost all of them have some number of determination statements that are going to be outsourced just by the nature of using these external managed services. So it is very, very important that managed service providers and external service providers are aware of this so that they can properly detail what's going on. Hopefully what most people are doing is they are matching their services and projects to what's going to be asked. Because if you're not matching it to the control statements, then you're not really doing justice to the level of rigor that needs to happen. But this is also convenient because it allows business owners to pick up the assessment guide that they're usually sort of maybe living in fear of or dreading the day of being assessed, and they can turn the tables on the market and they can say, you show me, according to these determination statements, what you're providing me. Like, you show me on this map how much assurance that you can give me for whatever service it is that you provide. And this works for dealing with consultants, cloud services, managed security services, managed IT services. It's the same pattern over and over again. And as we get into it, now I'll probably turn it mostly over to you, Scott, because we've gone through this approach. We've gone through and taken our specific offerings, our specific services, and mapped them to that level of detail that you need in a shared responsibility matrix.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jacob. So if we want to jump in to the next slide here, like we've been talking about all along, it's all about the assessment objects, the determination statements. We had to map to that level for our services, especially when you start talking about our managed services, the ongoing operational aspect of what we're doing for our customers from a managed services standpoint. We had to map to this level. And when you map to this level and you start looking at all the different interviews and interviewees and who's going to be asked what and all of that, not only, you have 320 assessment objectives and determination statements, but when you really break it out and blow it up and look at all the different potential people that could be interviewed, you're looking at, over 1,100 lines, of assessment that essentially has to be done. And so for us to be able to get to that level, we had to take it one step further than just trying to put a checkbox in there, because a checkbox just does not do it justice, because there's so much that could be misconstrued or read into what that checkbox actually means when you start talking about who's doing what from an operational standpoint in your environment. And so that's when we decided that we were going to take this and use what's called a RACI matrix on top of the shared responsibility matrix. So we've kind of got two different levels of matrices layered on top of one another to ensure that we can appropriately identify who is doing what in the environment for you as an organization. So if you're not familiar with a RACI matrix, it stands for responsible, accountable, consulted, or informed. And so when you develop a RACI matrix, you put out all the different people that are involved, or all the different organizations that are involved in a specific task or group of tasks, and then you start identifying who's responsible for this task, who is accountable to ensure this task is done, and that's not necessarily always the same people, who is going to get consulted as part of making sure this task gets executed, and who is going to be informed after the fact of, hey, this has been done. Who's getting the output of this thing taking place? And so we had to overlay this RACI structure on top of all 320 determination statements, plus all the different interviews and interviewees that would potentially need to be done. And that's where we got our shared responsibility matrix. Go ahead and flip the slide there. And this is what it looks like. And so as you start looking at this, this is a single control that we broke out. It has two determination statements, two assessment objectives, and what we've done, if you look across this, we have the control identifier. I think this one we're using is 3.5.5. Then you have the actual control itself, and then we break it down to the assessment objectives or the determination statements, and then we have a column there for, is Microsoft doing this as part of providing a service as part of Azure or Office 365? Then we have, what portion of this is being done by from a configuration standpoint. If Summit 7 is implementing your system, what work package in our CMMC level 2 implementation is actually going to be implementing this control statement for you. In this case, you can see work package 1 for the M365 side, work package 2 for the Azure side of an implementation. And then we have, does this require a policy or process to be put in place? And like we talked about earlier, there are policies, definitions that have to be made for many of these controls that are out there. So yes, in this case, we have to define a policy. And so we have a yes in that block. And then we get into the responsibilities for the interviews. For in this case, personnel responsible for identifier management, personnel responsible for information security, system developer, system or network administrators. Those are the 4 different people that could be interviewed for this specific assessment, or for this specific control, and the 2 assessment objectives that go with it. And so then on the right-hand side, that once we have implemented it, in the column there about the Summit 7 projects, we've implemented it, and then we have developed policies right there in the next column. Now we're getting over into the operational aspects of how this thing is going to be managed on a day-to-day basis. And so you can see that we have the responsibility and accountability on the customer for the first one, right? So the responsibility is to identify, or you have to build the policy, right? You have to identify what that period is going to be for which identifiers can't be reused. Is that period going to be 30 days? Is that period going to be a year? Is that period going to be 3 years? That policy has to be defined. So the customer is responsible for identifying that policy. They're also accountable for that. One very, very important thing that we have to understand is that the customer is accountable for all of this. For every single determination statement that there is going to be, the customer has to be accountable because it's your assessment, right? Now, if this was the Summit 7 assessment, then Summit 7 would be responsible for it. But this is the customer's assessment on the customer's tenant or the customer's infrastructure. The customer has to be accountable to ensure that happens. Now, responsibility can lay somewhere else. The responsibility for getting that done could be on the managed service provider or on the MSSP. But the accountability has to be on the customer for ensuring that happens. In this specific case, we have the responsibility is the customer to build that policy. Then they may consult with Summit 7 or with the managed service provider to help define what that period is, right? Maybe the customer is going to, hey, Summit 7, how long should we make this policy, or should we make this period be? Should we make it a year? Should we make it 30 days? What should we make it? That is the consulting piece. So, the MSP can provide that consultation to the customer, and then once the customer has made the determination, has written the policy, they need to inform back the MSP in this case that decision has been made, and here is the policy that we have defined for this specific determination statement. Right, and the consulting can go all the way down to the developer, the system and network administrators. Now we get to the second assessment objective and determination statements. The reuse of identifiers is prevented within the defined period. So the first assessment objective was essentially setting the policy, whereas the second assessment objective is actually implementing that control technically in the environment. So here, the customer is accountable to ensure it happens, right? But Summit 7 is responsible for ensuring that policy is active and is working in the environment. So we may consult with the customer about that. The customer may have input into that policy, right? Obviously, they've already written a policy or a policy document that identifies it. So we're consulting with the customer on that case. We are then informing the customer back that policy has been technically implemented in the environment. Okay, yeah. So that's where the ACI comes from a customer standpoint for that second determination statement. But the responsibility to ensure that it is in place is on the managed service provider in this case. And this is just one example of one control and how it has to break out. And some controls have 7, 8, 10 assessment objectives and determination statements with as many as 5, or I think 5 is the highest number of different interviewees, maybe 6, that you will see in any individual determination statement. But you can see how it breaks out, and it gets down over 1,100 lines of this when you take it all the way down for the 110 controls and the 320 assessment objectives. So it's very, very large and a lot of detail that you really have to define to ensure that you understand who is doing what in your environment, not just from an implementation standpoint, but from an ongoing day-to-day operational standpoint as well.
And that's a really great description, and you can start to see, this is probably a good example where this is a very clean example of there needs to be something defined, which is probably going to be a very consultative exchange between the provider and the customer. The customer may not have a specific requirement, they may not know. There's probably industry best practice that's going to cover some of these requirements. There might be external additional regulations that dictate what some of those parameters need to be defined as. Here, we're defining a period for something when it cannot be reused. The trap that you start to get into, though, is a lot of those parameters that get defined are who are the authorized users? What are the things that authorized users are allowed to do? What are the authorized software programs in the environment? Those are not things that your external provider can define for you. So if you look at a control mapping from a service provider, from free government security services, from gap assessments, whatever it happens to be, if it does not go down to this level of granularity, then you may be led into a situation where you are believing you are taking the attestation that the entirety of the control will be implemented, but some of the things that are required to be defined or documented or specified or identified necessarily cannot be done by the people who have made their mapping. It has to go to this level of detail for you to have assurance about what is actually occurring.
So we went through this whole process, right? And so the next thing we want to really talk about is kind of some statistics, that we pulled out of this. And we looked at that 1,100 lines of information, and we've broken all of this out. And so what does that end up being? So if you look at, from a control standpoint, about 38% of the controls are going to require the customer to develop a policy about that specific control. Just like Jacob was saying earlier, defining the period for reuse, defining the software programs, defining, X, Y, or Z, right? All those things have to be defined, and there has to be a policy around what that definition means, right? So 38% of them are going to have that. And then you look at the actual technical implementation requirements, and you're looking for all those for the 110 controls. And, if we looked at, what does Summit 7 do in our projects for, Microsoft 365 and Azure for those tenants? Because what we're talking about here is just the customer tenant. We're talking about Office 365 and Azure tenant implementations only. We're not talking about, random servers sitting on-prem or any of those kinds of things. We're simply talking about just the Office 365 Azure environment. The Summit 7 projects implement controls for 66% of those 110 controls. Those are all technical implementation requirements. So 66% of those 110 controls are going to get covered in some way for Office 365 and Azure implementations. And so those are really good numbers just to kind of keep in the back of your mind.
And these are both good numbers for an additional reason in that, first of all, in terms of the significant number of policies and procedures and things that need to be defined and documented in 800.171 and CMMC 2.0 is a common misconception in the switch from 1.0 to 2.0, because a lot of people heard that the process maturity requirements went away and that the documentation associated with process maturity went away. But if you know what is actually under the hood of your requirements, you will know that basically every single control has to be documented, defined, specified in some way. So those controls didn't really go away. And if you are utilizing a service provider or you are, trying to navigate your requirements, if you have been led to believe that you can get away without documented aspects of your control environment, then you need to revisit what the details are saying. The carryover from that, my advice to people all the time, is there are a lot of overzealous claims in the ecosystem about how much of the controls can be satisfied by external providers. I mean, we have seen, people who are external providers say that they can provide 100% of your compliance requirements with their service. We know that necessarily that is not true. Now, if you just go off the control statement and you say, we help with this control and we help with this control, well, we help with all the controls. We help with 100% of the controls, but what we can actually sort of prove in the shared responsibility matrix about what our services implement for you in a practical, tangible way, 66% of all the things that are contained in the document are actually implemented by what Scott was mentioning earlier.
Yeah, so let's jump down to the assessment objective level now. And so, we start looking at the assessment objective level. There's 43% of the assessment objectives that the customer is going to have responsibility for. The customer has to do something and has to have responsibility for it because something has to be defined or something like that, right? So while there's a large portion of this that can be outsourced, there's still a large portion that cannot be outsourced and has to be managed by you as the customer. Now, day-to-day operations of the environment, all of that, absolutely. But there are things up front that you're going to have someone on your team be responsible to ensure that these things happen, both from an upfront standpoint and in some cases an ongoing basis. Now, if you look at the ongoing requirements of the implementation and the day-to-day management of the environment, 89% of the assessment objectives can be implemented or can be implemented by a managed service provider, from specifically Summit 7. So if we were your MSP, 89% of the assessment objectives would have us involved on a day-to-day basis in the operational aspects of that specific control objective, assessment objective. Okay, and if you look at managed security services providers, and in some cases these things overlap, right? And you'll notice that these percentages don't necessarily add up to 100 in any way that you put them together, right? Because there are shared responsibilities even within assessment objectives. There are cases where the customer is going to have a portion of the responsibility, and the managed service provider is going to have a portion of the responsibility for the same exact assessment objective. They overlap, and so that's why you see 43 plus 89 equals much higher than 100%, right? So on the 13% with the MSSP, these are the things that you're looking at. Things that an MSSP typically would do, things like vulnerability scanning or incident response capabilities, those kinds of things that an MSSP typically does. And in some cases, they overlap. The MSP and MSSP services can overlap there as well. So,
yeah, and
that?
They definitely overlap, and I think that's as we wrap up here, and I know people have a lot of questions in chat. We've got a lot. We covered a lot of information. I think one of the key things to leave people with is that 171 is not done being revised. We're expecting revision 3 for 171 to come out. Controls change. The government will add more controls to the minimum baseline as the threat landscape changes. Different services that are offered by, Microsoft Cloud services, by managed security services. Things are shifting, not every day, but relatively often. And so some of these services will overlap. Some of these numbers will change. It's important to partner with people who have their thumb on the pulse of what's changing, what they offer within the context of what that means for your control implementation.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jacob.